At first, it looked like nothing, just a crumpled, old piece of paper shakily handed to the defense attorney seconds before the verdict. People in the courtroom chuckled, rolled their eyes. But then, he opened it, and within minutes, the entire room fell silent. No one was laughing anymore. His name was Thomas Greer. Most people never even noticed him. Just the quiet old janitor in the brown coat, pushing his mop down the marble halls of the courthouse he'd served for nearly 30 years. He didn't speak much, never interfered, but he was always there, sweeping up messes, emptying, trash, unlocking doors before dawn. Invisible to some, but not to the truth. Behind those tired eyes was a man who had seen more than anyone realized. And for nearly 2 decades, he carried a secret no one ever asked about. 17 years. Earlier, the same courtroom echoed with a different kind of silence. It was the trial of a young man named Elijah Freeman, just 19 at the time, a name barely known outside his small neighborhood, now stamped in bold across headlines, teen accused in armed robbery. He had no priors, no history of violence, no weapon was ever found. But the police said he matched the description, tall, wearing a dark hoodie, seen running from the store. That was all it took. The store clerk had pointed at Elijah in a photo lineup, not because he was sure, but because he looked kind of familiar. The security footage, blurry and nearly useless. The timestamp was off, and the man on tape had his face mostly covered, but somehow it all moved forward. Elijah's court-appointed lawyer was overwhelmed, juggling too many cases, missing deadlines. He tried to argue Elijah was at home when the robbery happened, helping his grandmother fix a broken kitchen sink. But no one else was there to back up that alibi, just Elijah's word and his grandmother's. And in that courtroom, there, words didn't carry much weight. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict. The judge, known for being tough on crime, handed Elijah a 20-year sentence without blinking. Elijah stood frozen, stunned, like the world had just shifted under his feet. His grandmother sobbed quietly in the back row, and among the court staff, sweeping the gallery after the crowd dispersed, was Thomas Greer. He remembered that day like a scar, because Thomas had seen something strange just before the trial began. He'd been cleaning the hallway near the jury room when he saw a man step out of the shadows near the evidence lockers. A man he'd never seen before, nervous, fidgeting, checking over his shoulder. He was holding something small and black in his hand, something he quickly shoved into his coat when he spotted Thomas. Thomas didn't say a word. He just nodded politely and kept walking. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the guy was just a lawyer or a clerk running late. Maybe it wasn't his business, but something about the man's eyes had chilled him. So he said nothing, and life went on. For 17 years, Thomas swept the same floors, listened to the same kinds of cases. He saw guilty men go free, and innocent ones disappear behind bars. And every now and then, he'd think about Elijah Freeman, wonder what became of him, wonder if he still believed someone would one day speak the truth. But Thomas never imagined that day would come, until the trial was reopened. 17 years later, something unexpected happened. A non-profit legal team specializing in wrongful convictions took interest in Elijah's case. And as they dug deeper, buried truths began to surface. Truths that had been overlooked, dismissed, or deliberately ignored. First, it was the security footage. The original tape used in court had been mysteriously shortened, but a copy, misfiled and forgotten, showed an extra 46 seconds. In that final stretch, the figure seen in the store appeared to be left-handed. Elijah was right-handed. Then came the witness retraction. The store clerk, now retired and battling guilt, admitted he'd felt pressured to pick someone. He wasn't sure then, And now, he was certain Elijah wasn't the one. Conflicting statements, incomplete evidence logs, doubts that had always been there, now impossible to ignore. Elijah's lawyers filed an appeal, citing new evidence and a flawed trial process. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the court agreed to hear his case again. Word spread fast. The story of the wrongly convicted young man, now middle-aged and still behind bars, hit local news, then national headlines. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Activists gathered on the steps. People who had never known Elijah now carried signs with his name. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Former classmates, community members, even strangers who had followed the case online. They all came to witness what they hoped would be justice, finally served, and in the very back row sat Thomas Greer, older now. His hands trembled slightly from arthritis. His once dark hair had faded to grey. But the courtroom felt the same. The same cold walls, the same uncomfortable benches, the same echoing footsteps, and the same guilt, still sitting heavy on his chest. He hadn't come to speak. He told himself he was just there to watch, to bear witness, to see if maybe, finally, the truth would win. As the defense attorney began laying out the new evidence, murmurs rippled. Through the room, faces shifted, doubts formed. The original conviction, once so certain, now looked fragile, like it could fall apart with one more detail. That's when Thomas reached into his coat pocket. For weeks, he'd carried it with him, a small, worn piece of lined paper, not typed, not scanned, just a handwritten note, shaky in his own script. Words he'd rehearsed 100 times, rewritten again and again late at night when sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't much, just what he saw, what he remembered, and what he failed to say 17 years ago. He stared at it for a long time, unsure if he had the courage. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge paused the hearing. A break was called. People stood to stretch, lawyers whispered in corners, cameras clicked from the gallery. But Thomas remained seated, gripping that note like it was the last piece of something he'd nearly lost forever. And then he stood. Slowly, steadily, he made his way to the defense attorney. No words, no announcement. Just an old man handing over a folded piece of paper before turning back to his seat. No one paid much attention, not yet, but what that note said would change everything. The next morning, as the court reconvened after a brief break, Thomas stood up once more. His hands, slightly trembling, from age and years of regret, clutched the same folded note, the one he had carried for so long, the one he had never dared to share. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing louder than ever in the hushed courtroom. The defense attorney, still reviewing the evidence, barely looked up as Thomas approached. The old janitor handed the sealed note over without a word. The attorney glanced at the paper, his expression unreadable. Without a second thought, he tucked it into his suit pocket, ready to move on with the next motion. But something in Thomas's eyes, something about the way the old man lingered in the doorway, made him pause. And that pause was all it took. He took the note from his pocket and unfolded it, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper carefully. His brow furrowed as he began to read the words that had been penned more than 17 years ago. The courtroom was silent. Everyone had their eyes on the attorney, wondering if this small, crumpled piece of paper could possibly be worth their attention. Most of them were still fixated on the new evidence already laid out, the new footage, the clerk's retraction, the flawed trial. How could one note change it all? But then the defense attorney's eyes widened. He looked up from the note, scanning the room as if trying to process what he had just read. His hands began to shake ever so slightly as he placed the note down on the table. In that moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The defense attorney turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low but trembling, "I believe this could be the key to the case." The judge looked at him, uncertain, waiting for an explanation, and so the defense attorney spoke, slowly, deliberately. "This note, it was written on the day of the robbery. Thomas Greer, the janitor, witnessed something that no one else did, and what's on this paper, these details, only an eyewitness could have known." The room shifted. Reporters, journalists, even the prosecution leaned in, waiting to hear more. The defense attorney unfolded the note again, his eyes scanning over the details Thomas had written down. "There's a suspicious car," he read aloud. "Dark green, parked just behind the alley on the night of the robbery, partial license plate number DF5791, and an unknown figure walking toward the store right before the crime happened, someone no one else ever mentioned." The air seemed to thicken in the room as the defense attorney paused, letting those words hang in the air for a moment. There were murmurs in the crowd, whispers that filled the space between breaths. Some looked confused, some looked stunned, and a few, they looked afraid. Thomas Greer had never told anyone about the car. Not in 17 years, not a single soul had ever known. He had kept it all inside, in a quiet place, afraid of what it might mean if he spoke up. But now it was out in the open. The note had done what Thomas couldn't. The defense attorney looked down again, scanning the paper with a quiet intensity. The detail in the note was precise, the kind of details a passerby could never notice. A partial license plate, a car parked in a specific place no one had ever mentioned before, and that shadowy figure, a person seen only by Thomas, walking toward the store moments before the robbery took place. Thomas's heart beat faster in his chest. He had seen all of this, just as he had written it. He had never known how to explain it, but now the pieces were falling together. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, not a sound except for the soft rustling of paper. The judge turned to the prosecution, who seemed caught off guard by this new development. "This is," the prosecutor began, pausing as if to regain his composure. "This is new evidence, evidence that could change everything." The defense attorney nodded, his voice steady. "This isn't just new evidence. This is proof that Elijah Freeman might have been framed." The tension in the room escalated with every word. The crowd leaned forward, as if the weight of the moment was pressing against their chests. The walls, once so familiar to Thomas, now felt as if they were closing in on him. The note, written in his hurried hand, now had the power to change everything. The courtroom remained silent as the defense attorney finished reading the note aloud. Every word, every detail that had been hidden for so long now hung in the air. It was a weighty silence, the kind that presses against your chest and leaves you breathless. Elijah Freeman, sitting across the room, hadn't said a word. He was still, motionless, his eyes locked onto Thomas Greer, the man whose name had never been spoken in the case until now. There were no loud exclamations, no calls for justice, just a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. In that, Thomas didn't know if he had done the right thing. He only knew that he had seen something important, and had kept quiet for far too long. And now, with Elijah's eyes upon him, he finally understood that the truth, no matter how painful, had to come to light. But the moment wasn't over yet. The note had sparked something more than just tears in Elijah's eyes. It had sparked action. Investigators, now working with the new evidence, had a new lead to follow. The car, the partial license plate, the shadowy figure. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For days, they combed through the old files, reviewing every minute detail of the case again, checking old records and re-examining the surveillance footage. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. And finally, after an exhaustive investigation, they found him. The man who had committed the robbery, the man who had framed Elijah Freeman for his crime. It was an unlikely turn of events, a criminal with no ties to the case, no history of involvement. But in the end, it didn't matter. The truth had been uncovered, and the real culprit was found. In a dark twist of fate, the real criminal confessed. With his confession, everything that had been lost for so long, Elijah's freedom, his dignity, his future, was finally returned to him. And as the news of the confession spread, people in the courtroom began to react, their faces mixed with disbelief, anger, and relief. But in that one moment, as the investigators closed the case, there was only one thing on Thomas's mind. He had done the right thing. He had freed a man, and in doing so, he had freed himself. And as Elijah stood in the courtroom, a free man for the first time in 17 years, the two men exchanged one last glance. No words were needed. Their eyes spoke volumes of what had been lost and what had been won. The room grew still as the judge, after reviewing all the evidence, finally stood to deliver the verdict. The tension in the air was palpable, but for the first time in this long and painful journey, there was a glimmer of hope. The judge, an older man with years of experience etched into his face, cleared his throat. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of the moment. After reviewing the new evidence, the court has no... And, the judge said, his gaze shifting toward the back of the room, where Thomas Greer stood silently, a figure who had been unnoticed for so long. There is one more thing. Sometimes justice takes its time, but it still arrives. And it arrives because of people like Thomas Greer. A hush fell over the courtroom. The crowd turned, eyes wide, toward the old janitor, who had quietly remained a part of the background until this moment. Thomas didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his hands folded in front of him. A man who had never expected recognition. The judge continued, his voice strong with respect. It was Thomas Greer who carried the truth for all these years. It was his courage, his willingness to come forward, that has set things right. This court and this nation owe him a debt. The words hit Thomas like a wave, unexpected and overwhelming. He had always felt like a shadow, a figure who swept up dust and mopped the floors of the courthouse. He never imagined his actions would lead to something like this. The reverence of a judge, the admiration of strangers, and yet there it was. The justice that had eluded Elijah for so long, the truth that had been buried, all because of one simple act. One man's decision to speak up after years of silence. The courtroom stood, not for the law, not for the judge's decision, but for the janitor who had carried the truth, for the quiet man who had finally done the right thing. As the applause swelled around him, Thomas stood motionless, not understanding the full impact of what had just happened. But Elijah, now standing tall beside him, gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had been achieved. It wasn't just Elijah who was free that day, it was Thomas too. He had freed himself from the weight of years of doubt and silence, and in doing so, he had helped restore the dignity of a man who had never deserved to lose it. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of legal proceedings. It was a place of redemption, a place where truth had finally won. The next morning, Thomas Greer arrived at work, as he had for nearly 3 decades, without any fanfare. He entered the courthouse through the back door, as he always did, sweeping the floors and emptying trash cans with the same quiet diligence. The world had changed around him, but he hadn't. The media had descended on the courthouse, eager to speak to anyone who had been involved in the case, but Thomas wasn't interested. The cameras flashed and reporters gathered in front of the courthouse, but he walked past them without a second glance. He knew the spotlight wasn't for him. His role had never been about recognition. It had always been about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. When reporters finally caught up with him later that day, they asked him about his newfound fame, about the impact of his actions on Elijah's life. But Thomas simply smiled, shrugging with humility. "He deserved the truth," he said softly. And then he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the courthouse once more. So when you hear this story, remember this: every story matters, every voice matters. The world may be full of noise, full of people striving to be seen, to be heard, but sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that make the greatest impact. Thomas Greer didn't speak loudly, he didn't raise his voice, but when he chose to stand up for truth, his voice carried across the years. It reverberated through the courthouse and through the heart of a man who had lost everything. And in doing so, it changed the future. So as you go about your day, remember, it's not always the loudest who are the strongest. And it's not always the most obvious heroes who change the world. Sometimes it's the ones who walk in silence, carrying their truth with them, waiting for the right moment to share it. The story of Thomas and Elijah is a reminder that all of us have the power to change the world. It doesn't matter if you wear a uniform or a suit, or if you simply wear the clothes of a humble janitor. What matters is the choice to stand up for what is right, no matter the consequences, to speak when the world asks us to be quiet, to give voice to the voiceless. Because in the end, we all have a story to tell. And sometimes, the most unexpected voices are the ones that can change everything. If you believe in quiet heroes who change the world without ever asking for recognition, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real life stories that inspire and remind us all of the strength in the quietest voices.